Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of a Small History podcast. My name is Nick Small. I have a master's degree from Wilfrid Laurier University, and the purpose of this podcast is for me to share my historical interests with the rest of the world. In today's inaugural episode, we will be addressing the big methodological questions that form the foundations of how I look at history and historical topics. It's going to be a little bit abstract and sometimes a little confusing, but that's what makes it fun. Today's focus is answering one of what seems to be one of the simplest questions on the surface. What is history and why does it matter? So what is history? On the surface it sounds very simple and can be summarized with a quick Google search, and often you'll get something that results in history is the study of the past. Now, that's pretty simple. A little too simplistic, maybe. Sure, anybody can study the past, but what does it mean to study history, and how does it separate someone like the general public going through a history textbook that you get at school, looking at names and dates, versus someone who treats it as a profession? Now, it can sound rather boring if you're just going to sit in a classroom and simply memorize names and dates, famous people, places, and then expect to regurgitate them on a test and then never remember these facts further on down the road. In academia, history has only really been around as a degreed profession since around the 1870s in England. So it's actually a rather new profession. How I like to look at history is to explore it through looking at our own everyday life and comparing it with those who have lived in similar circumstances in the past and relating to or applying those lessons to today. For example, how do I put food on the table tonight is a question that has been asked for more than 3,000 years in human history. We look to history to explain how we evolved from tribal hunter-gatherer societies, beginning agricultural practices, and constantly evolve into the modern technologies we enjoy today through the use of AI technology, through the use of mechanical irrigation systems, factories, the printing press, and things like that. It's up to academic historians to read, research, analyze source material from when it was written and contextualize that research into a manner that is easy to understand for the general public, but also detailed enough and supported with sources to give it credibility, and in order to give a fair and objective view of what things were actually like in the past. And this can be rather difficult. For example, it poses one initial question. When do we allocate the beginning of history? Because we use prehistoric as a term, so that means that history itself has to start at some point. As I mentioned before, it's a rather young academic profession, but we know that through the studies of ancient history, whether it be the Aztec, Romans, Egyptians, indigenous peoples of North America, or China, history goes well back than just 150 years ago. If you're looking at something like the Aztecs or the Inca, it's at least 500 years ago. If we look at indigenous peoples, China, Egypt, ancient Greece and Rome, we can go back to 2,000 years and even further. My opinion is that what separates history from prehistory has to do with the human nature and that human ability, that need to create artifacts, monument things, write documents with the purpose of it to be looked at from someone in the future to learn something about the past and understand it. In E.H. Carr's monumental work on the topic, What is History?, he directly compares the human nature to any other animal. For example, humans could be like a bear in a forest with their animal instincts to wander the forest, eat food, drink water, sleep in order to survive, find a mate, create a next generation of animals, and rinse and repeat the process. But what separates humanity is some of these human moralistic tendencies that have evolved over time. For example, a hunter gatherer might pass on their techniques of hunting with a spear to their offspring, but then it also then entails things as it evolves, like for example, if you're harvesting apples off a tree, well, if the tree belongs to a neighbor's private property, that human instinct of needing food to survive then becomes surpassed by this moralistic tendency. Do I trespass on this individual's property to take something that belongs to them and not me at face of repercussion? If you look outside your window and you see a squirrel stealing nuts or fruit off your own tree, you're not going to look at it the same way as you would another human trespassing on your property. We also know that dinosaurs, for example, have lived millions of years before humans, but it's only through their discovery of fossilized remains that we know they even existed. We have zero recorded experience on how ancient dinosaurs roamed the earth, and we only make educated guesses through archaeology into understanding how exactly they lived, ate, and died. Whereas for humans, humans have often left artifacts, pieces of their past, or often their present, to be looked at by future generations. For example, we can look at various examples. There's in ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, you have a lot of monolithic shrines. If you look at China, you have the oracle bones, which date back more than 3,000 years. They're some of the very earliest elements of human writing anywhere in the world. History also often exists as a subtopic of other fields of study. It can be perceived as a humanity, it can be perceived as a liberal art, it can be perceived as a social science, in the way that we try to quantify things about human existence. But it also exists as a component of other disciplines. For example, try to take a political science course on Canadian American government. Naturally, the starting point would be to look at history. How did America's government get founded? How did Canada's government get founded as a response to it? If you were to look at economics, economists always use past economic performances to try to make an educated guess, a prediction towards future market trends, especially when we get into kind of the current situations with tariffs and potential recessions. We look a lot to the 1930s and how to navigate to avoid following such trends in a tough recession, in where a lot of people would struggle to get by in such cases. Natural and physical sciences. Everything that is done in research is often based on the work of someone else, whether directly or indirectly. And that's how we've advanced from the times where we had such significant deaths from things like polio, measles, smallpox, and the like, to now almost virtually eradicating them, and to even having diseases. When we look back at the COVID-19 pandemic just 5 years ago, it took within 2 years to have a vaccine for COVID, which is unprecedented for any disease ever before. In other arts, we also look at history for inspiration. We can look at paintings by Mozart and Beethoven, musical works by Mozart and Beethoven, paintings by Michelangelo and Picasso, or architecture from Canadians like Raymond Moriyama and Douglas Cardinal to inspire. It's important that we look at the past to discover new ideas, but also pay homage to past experiences. Now, the study of history is one important element, but like how the stories of past can change over time, the practice of history itself can change as well. As a historian, we use the term historiography to study history itself and how perspectives have changed over time. The aforementioned book, E.H. Carr's What is History, is, since the 1960s, has been one of the best examples of this. More recently, in 1999, Richard Evans' book, In Defense of History, is another exceptional work that takes a real deep dive into understanding how historians have changed their approaches over time. I'll break it down a little bit simply here, but initially you have works like Herodotus, the Histories, covering the Greco-Persian War in around 400 BC, that kind of chronologizes the events that happen. And on the surface, this is what we would look at as something like a primary source. This is trying to record actively what is happening in an event in a specific time period and articulate it as accurately as possible. A primary source is often reflective in the values and the beliefs of when it is written. Another German historian, Leopold von Ranke, is famously known for taking these primary sources and trying to condense them and to take the facts for what they are in an objective manner. However, this can present some challenges to presenting history. How does one convey and write about a piece, an active event taking place, and try to articulate it in a way that can be visualized and studied and understood by people in the future? If I were to say, imagine a tree, without more descriptive words, we can come up with different envisions of what a tree is like. Someone might picture a maple tree with colorful autumn leaves. Another might picture an apple tree with lush green leaves and ripe, shiny apples. A third individual might picture a cherry blossom tree with calming pink, purple, and white petals. And no matter how descriptive one can get in their writing, it can be extremely difficult to accurately articulate an event. In military history is a good example. We can take all the documents we want, we can record on maps where units, where ships, where planes were at the time of a landmark event, whether it be the Battle of Cannae, the Battle of Jutland, and others. It's really hard to truly envision what was actually going on with all the people running around with bullets and arrows flying everywhere. To try to articulate exactly what specifically took place is really difficult, and often you get into this objective view. No matter how hard Herodotus tried, and I believe he genuinely tried to be objective at portraying the war, the bravery of soldiers on both the Greek side and the Persian side, if you're looking at it from behind the Greek lines, you're not going to get the same accurate, objective interpretation as you would if you were able to somehow simultaneously observe it from the Persian side. In modern times, we often look towards history through the great man or the great individual. Oftentimes we try to simplify topics and look through it through the eyes of the individuals at the top reigns of power. We like to study famous kings and queens, famous emperors, famous military and political leaders as we get into the 20th century, and we try to look through things through their eyes. We try to look through battles through the perspective of Napoleon Bonaparte, through Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill. And often that can be a good entry point into understanding some of the major decisions made in a conflict. But oftentimes, especially as we have gotten into modern history, and to revisionist history and to postmodernism. I'll get to those points in more specifically in a moment. But these criticisms of great man history become apparent because while there are sometimes major decisions in a battle or in the direction of a country's economy that a top political leader might make key decisions, very much history is also a product of the people that live through those periods, the peasantry and sort of the general public that are most impacted and most drastically contribute to these decisions. Military history, again, is a really good example of this. It's easy to look at something like the Battle of Midway, or the Battle of Stalingrad, or the campaigns in North Africa as specific instances in where a war has turned in favor of one side versus the other. But more often than not, it often falls down to logistics. It comes down to the home front, which has been now studied tremendously in modernist history in order to understand what the working class was doing on the home front in order to contribute to support the war effort. Germany and Japan did not lose the World War necessarily on the battlefields, but they lost it because they did not have the population to contribute resources, build tanks, build guns, build ammunition that the West was able to. They were able to outproduce them, and in terms of food as well, in food and clothing. A good argument for this is in the First World War. The Germans won the Eastern Front against the Russian forces in the First World War, but as a consequence, you now had to care for a massive occupied force in Eastern Europe and having to transition those troops over to the Western Front while the home front was struggling to provide their own supplies through the blockades that the British were enacting on German naval trade. Modernist history is where we start to see these ideas transition from the great man into these societal implications. A lot of it comes through cultural Marxism, where we start looking at the factory workers or the farmers as the driving forces of change. In more recent times, it's taken that extent further beyond into what's known as postmodernism. Postmodernism is where we then start to look at not just class, but we look at gender roles, we look at races in society, and how those are impacted. And often there's criticisms on already existing modernist works because of criticism towards the people writing about it. For a long time in academic history, it has been written by the white man. And it's a fair criticism. How do we get the voices of previously marginalized groups in community without gay people, without black people, without women, without indigenous people directly articulating it themselves? And this too can come with challenges because sometimes sources are interpreted differently, not necessarily as a bad thing, but it can also open the door to really broad criticisms, especially when it starts to lean towards the values of freedom of speech. Richard Evans, in Defense of History, is a good example of this, where a professor of the Holocaust history in Atlanta had to directly oppose taking debates against Holocaust deniers because by simply having the processes of a debate with a Holocaust denier, well, now you're enabling and validating that point of something that is just not true. To put it in maybe a more modern example, it would be like for many of people my age and older, around the age of 30 and older, everybody remembers September 11th, 9/11, the terrorist attacks, as a major event in human history. How can you debate someone who fundamentally does not believe these events happened? It's incredibly difficult. And that's what postmodernism has enabled to an extent, where points of sometimes preposterous nature are now validated because all perspectives have to be interpreted and valued on even footing. This is where then it becomes really important to understand the source material that's being chosen. Now, within the last 5 years, 10 years, I would even take that a step further and argue beyond postmodernism, historians are now often dealing with the challenge of AI, artificial intelligence learning, where we would be able to understand it if students were taking too much of a source and not contextualizing it in their own words, basically copying word from word. That's where you can get into criticisms of von Rankian style research, where it starts to lean on plagiarism. You're simply taking other people's works and wording it into your own. Now, AI has made it really easy to simply say, I need a 1,000-word paper on this topic, on this individual, on these events. And it's really easy now for AI to produce an okay paper where it's citing source material and it's trying to make arguments supporting one side. This can feed into this postmodernism where if you chain the shackles of an AI to research a topic from one perspective wholly, you run into problems where, yeah, if you say, hey, I need you to find all these sources that say this event doesn't happen or that this event was flawed, that's where you get into challenges in academia, especially now where it's becoming harder and harder to know whether or not your paper you're reading and grading is written by an AI or not. So, bringing things back to full circle, then what is then the purpose of history? Well, intrinsically, I think a lot of times we don't look at it directly, but history does have a major impact on our everyday lives. We can look at famous events, commemorating battles, commemorating individuals like our veterans who have fought and died for our country on events like Remembrance Day. And often we can tie in our understandings to where we are today from it. As I mentioned before, we tend to look at current problems through the past to try to understand things. And as American University Chinese professor Justin Jacobs points out in his own podcast, Beyond Huaxia, Huaxia, often it can lead to idolizing the past, which can also be dangerous. We can look at the golden days of our grandparents' generation in a very positive light, in that all these problems today did not exist somehow in the past and that everything was better. Well, if we were to look at 100 years ago, for example, the period of the Roaring Twenties in North America, for starters, we have to deal with prohibition, that alcohol was largely restricted. There was segregation. There was a lot of limits on women's rights. There were virtually no rights for indigenous people, even more curtailed rights on Chinese or Asian Canadians. We have to look at the increased prevalence of diseases, really horrible diseases, polio, influenza, smallpox, as I mentioned before. Even looking at something as simple as food, we don't have the same kind of fancy high-class dining. You can't simply go on Uber through your phone or on the internet and order fried chicken takeout. Often foods would be very simple. You would not have as much access to meat. Foods would predominantly consist of bread, consist of root vegetables. if you were lucky, maybe you'd have some sugar and be able to make a really simple biscuit or cake. But all of these things are something that we don't take into context. I don't know how many people would be able to survive 100 years ago without the internet, without the telephone, without the radio, even to an extent, where your means of communication were restricted to Morse code and letters. It's really important then, as a historian, when we talk about these topics, we always try our best to look at it in an objective light, where we try to look at it from a multifaceted perspective, from different angles, how things are. But oftentimes things simply don't get covered or get left out, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And that's what history is largely about. It's about trying to get all of these different voices and articulating it to get a true appreciation and understanding for what the past was like. There's an old saying, the past is a foreign country. And that's how I try to look at history and how a lot of historians try to look at it. We look at history because, in the same way that we like to travel, if you're from North America like I am and you travel to Brazil, you travel to Germany or France or England or to China or to Japan or to India, a lot of why we travel is that we want that experience. There's kind of an enjoyment of being outside your comfort zone, of understanding how a different group of people live, how they deal with different circumstances, different climate, different weather, different agriculture, different religious beliefs. History is largely to that within your own country, even to a large extent. If you're to look back at how your country was 100, 200 years ago, you get a much greater appreciation for how other people have lived before you. A challenge of that, too, is that we tend to look at it through our modern day perceptions of what a nation or a nation state is. If you look at a map of the current countries in the world today, the maps are very different 50 years ago. The maps are different 100 years ago. The maps are very different 2,000 years ago. How we look at society and how people lived is often very different. We can't look at it through the beliefs of people living as one homogeneous nation. Often it's broken down into much smaller groupings, often tribalistic at times, or through empires, which are very different than modern nation states. We look at it in order to understand how people lived, how they survived, and what things they valued, why they wanted to create certain monuments, for the understanding and the appreciation of people like you and me existing today. That we want to know the certain elements of great Egyptian kings like Tutankhamun, Cleopatra, why we should appreciate their religious beliefs, their gods or goddesses, how Greek and Roman gods and goddesses continue to impact everyday human life, that we continue to use it to name the planets and the moons of outer space. And in a way, it goes full circle, because everything we do today, in a way, is we are actively creating our own primary sources, our own history. Historians 20, 30, 50 years down the road are going to look at things like Twitter. They're going to look at this podcast. They're going to look at videotapes, VCRs, DVDs. They're going to look at all these creations that we have made over the last decade to understand what kind of the world was like when we lived and what things we valued. Why do we value our own military history? Why do we value sporting events? Why do we value music and food and culture? It's all aspects of how we lived, and I think there's an inherent belief, similar to the ways of how the first tribes wanted to instill values of why you needed to build shelter, why you needed to go and hunt, why you needed to harvest and plant berries so that they would grow and you would have more berries in the future. In that same way, we believe that the things that we are doing right now are of value to people in the future. And that's what history is fundamentally about. And it's fun because we get to look at all these different perspectives, and we do, through historiography, get to see how it evolves. And it in most cases, opens new doors for us to examine topics. The Second World War is a good example where it's been studied to death in military history, yet people continue to find new avenues and approach and things to look at. And that's what I'm hoping to do as part of this podcast. I'm a very weird person. I have interests in various aspects of history. Military history, especially Canadian military history, is one I've appreciated since I was in middle school. And then it's evolved to my appreciations and understanding of Japan, of China, and of East Asia as a whole. It's evolved my understanding of sports history and why we look at sporting events, and we value the traditions of games that have been played for over 100 years and reflecting on it in its modern sense and how we can often be resistant to change. As we know, the CFL is making some of the biggest changes it has in decades, and there is a lot of hesitant to it, and I think it has to do because of people valuing the history of the game and how it's gotten to its current place. And I hope to share that in future episodes of this podcast. And then in another way, history is just fun because you often learn something new. You learn more about people. As we see through Remembrance Day, you learn about why people remember their ancestors, why we remember conflicts. We remember it because we look at it through an ideological standpoint. We look through it that people gave these lives so that we can live in the kind of lives that we do today. And how we commemorate it through memory, whether it be through writing books, as the late Tim Cook has, or through just visiting a cenotaph once a year on Remembrance Day. There's a lot of value that we put in society on those before us. And even if we shouldn't necessarily idolize everything about the past, we do need to accept an appreciation for what they have done. So this concludes my values on why I believe history is important. I thank you for tuning in and listening today. If you wish to follow more material, as I have cited in these works throughout the show, you can read E.H. Carr's What is History, published in 1961. You can read Richard J. Evans' In Defense of History, published in 1999. You can always read Herodotus, the Histories, published initially written in 430 BC, and there's probably a Penguin translation version of it probably within the last 10-20 years. If you want to look at something a little more abstract, you could look at Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, and that's kind of a book that looks into that postmodernism, that history is somehow ending with the fall of the Cold War. Richard Evans' book was published shortly after and is in many ways a response to that, so I encourage you to look at The End of History. And then if you're looking at another podcast, as this one is still in its infancy and is beginning to grow, I highly, highly recommend you take a listen to the first couple episodes of Justin Jacobs' Beyond Huaxia, HUAXIA podcast, which really gives a good approach to understanding history and to going into China, because oftentimes for China specifically, we tend to look at it as one thing that's always existed and just had different people leading it. But really, as you dive down into it, China has often been ruled by nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples outside of kind of the central Yellow River and Yangtze Valley in kind of what we would deem to be central China. So there's a lot of fun things to explore there, and how the China of 2,000 years ago is very, very, very different from the modern People's Republic of China. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to this podcast. I would also like to send some thanks out to a couple of historians who directly or indirectly have influenced my appreciation for the subject. The ones I'm thinking of are from Wilfrid Laurier University. My supervisor, Dr. Blaine Chason. I want to thank Dr. Adam Kruar, who was my historiography teacher, professor back in the day, almost a decade ago now, if I can believe it. I'd also like to thank the late Dr. Alan Gordon from the University of Guelph. I would like to thank Dr. James Fraser from the University of Guelph for his continued support. And I would also like to thank the late Tim Cook. With his passing specifically over the last not even month now, it's really shown to me through two of my favorite books of his, Cleo's Warriors and The Fight for History, that it really can't be something that historians sit down on, and that historians need to fight for their own history. And over the last 5 years since receiving my history degree, I felt I haven't done enough to put it into action. The purpose of this podcast, more than anything, is to put it to work. And through these next podcasts, where I'll be sharing my love of Japan, my love of history, my love of military history of Canada and of sports, I hope that you will grow to love studying history and learning about our great world as much as I have. Thank you very much for listening. As always, like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you on the next episode. It'll be a fairly short one, but next week I am leaving on a trip to Japan where I will be uploading smaller episodes. So I will be, in this next episode, briefly outlining what I intend to do in Japan and things you can look forward to in the next episode. Thank you so much. Take care and have a great week.